Hello, welcome to my review of the Doctor Who story Robot. Don't forget to press subscribe, and if you can help me on Patreon, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. Let's crack on. I've watched Robot a number of times, it has to be said. I've also watched it on the new shiny Blu-ray stuff that's come out with all the extras. I've watched the production notes, I've watched the programme with the commentary as well, and I've been reading about it in About Time, a really useful book on Doctor Who, a series of books in fact. As well as being Tom Baker's first story, it's also the first story of season 12, although for reasons we'll get into later, it was actually filmed at the end of season 11. It was broadcast between the 28th of December 1974 and the 18th of January 1975. It got around about 10 million viewers per episode, so it was quite a good start to the season. And it was produced by Barry Letts and written by Terrance Dicks. Now, of course, they are the main people responsible for the Pertwee era. So effectively what we've got is the start of a new era, but with the production team of the old era. That accounts for the fact that we don't really see Tom Baker in full flow. We don't yet see the Philip Hinchcliffe era, although he was shadowing Barry Letts while this process was going on, at the same time working on the scripts for the rest of the season, scripts which had already been got together by Barry Letts and Terrance Dicks. So what we have is a very, very different kind of Tom Baker story. Obviously at the time that is not really the consideration. What we're seeing is a new Doctor, and it probably would have just looked like somebody stepping into Jon Pertwee's shoes, I imagine. But looking back now, we can see that it's not really a stereotypical Hinchcliffe era story. It's not really a stereotypical Tom Baker story. By now, of course, viewers watching Doctor Who would have been quite aware of the lead actor changing. This is the third time it happens. And it's the first time we get a scene involving the Doctor choosing their outfit in a way that's been copied throughout the series since. Obviously Jon Pertwee basically just picked up some clothes, but here we have a scene where the Doctor contemplates what they're going to wear, and it's played for laughs. Despite the Doctor not really being present and fully formed in the first episode, Tom gives such an assured performance throughout the rest of the story that you'll no doubt who the Doctor is, and it's interesting to compare that to later first stories for lead actors, where the Doctor is often incapacitated trying to work out who he's going to be. Once the Doctor's decided who he's going to be in this story, he consistently acts in that way, and there's no doubt about him not working out who he is or wondering what kind of Doctor he's going to be. It's settled straight away, and the story can progress. So this story is the first to include outside broadcast and entirely shot on videotape, thanks to some new lightweight or more lightweight cameras in that era. So they use those for the first time. And so I have a little bit of respect for the experimentation in this story, that they're actually using and attempting new techniques. The story itself, as we'll get into, is far from perfect, and I'll be giving my full rating out of 10 at the end. But I do like the fact that they're trying something new here. They're trying something different, and that should be applauded. That's what Doctor Who's about. That experimentation is quite important because Doctor Who's kind of leading the way on this as well. Many of the techniques that Barry Letts in particular is trying to employ in Doctor Who, he will use later on the classic serial, which he moved on to. And other dramas will follow suit as well. So it's not just, we shouldn't just view Doctor Who in isolation, particularly at the time. The BBC, an awful lot of people would have been mixing on different shows and so on and so forth. It wasn't so much a coherent production team that just stayed distinct in their own little world, though people would be moving on to other things all the time and mixing and matching the techniques. They even managed to look into some footage of a helicopter flying over the location where they were filming, and they needed a helicopter for the story. So they even managed to capture that on videotape, because or else they would have had to have got stock footage, which would have undoubtedly been on film and would have looked a bit jarring. So they were quite lucky in that respect. And just before we end the context around this story, let's just remember also that there was industrial action at the time, and that involved scenery changes, and so they couldn't suddenly shift scenery around, and that meant that the studio which Doctor Who was being filmed in had to be shared with other programmes, most notably Blue Peter, and there's some wonderful archive footage of Blue Peter being presented from the Doctor Who studio, the Unit HQ studio. Fantastic. Plot-wise, like I say, this is more of a Pertwee than a Tom Baker story in many ways, but really what this is Doctor Who's attempt at King Kong. Let's take a look at the reputation that this story's got. I think it's got quite a poor reputation. People often talk about the model, the toy tank, the fact that the robot doesn't look very convincing when it's moving, and so on and so forth. Tom, in the first episode at least, not really being given anything to do other than silly little pieces. But I think that's a little bit unfair. I would say at the very best this is kind of middle of the road Doctor Who. So the Doctor. The Doctor isn't fully formed, the Fourth Doctor, yet, I don't think. I think that comes later when we start to see the Hinchcliffe era, and it comes pretty much straight away in Ark in Space. The Doctor is absolutely spot on there. In this, he's obviously in the Pertwee environment. He does some Pertwee things, or some things that we've seen Pertwee do, like keeping the key hidden in his shoe, which happened in Spearhead, a nice little nod to the past. But one thing about Tom's Doctor is he is instantly an alien. You know, I think Tom Baker might well be an alien, and it comes across really well. One odd thing about this story is the morality of the Doctor is quite odd. I mean, basically he kills the robot at the end, and it's a sentient being, and we know that it's a sentient being that has been having enormous troubles working out what its place in the world is, and is tormented throughout the story. And the resolution is to simply kill it. It's essentially murder is the resolution of the story. And I think that's overlooked because it's a robot, fine. But you can't overlook it actually, because the whole middle part of the story is the relationship between Sarah and the robot, and how and the vulnerability that the robot has. And the position that it's put in. You can't ignore that morality, really. The Doctor's a murderer. Also on the morality of the Doctor, we've got used to, in the modern era, of the Doctor choosing companions because the Doctor thinks they're brilliant people to travel with. In this, at the end, he basically allows Harry into the TARDIS as a bit of a joke, just to prove a point. Not the best strategy for choosing a travelling companion. So a friend of mine, Matt, told me his first impressions of Tom in this story. He thought Tom Baker's rather good, a contrast to Pertwee with some of the anarchy and silliness of Troughton, but not as annoying. So that's I'm guessing he's not a massive fan of Troughton then. But yeah, that's quite a good way of describing the character in this, at least, I think. Yeah, good point. So moving on to Sarah, I think Elizabeth Sladen really excels in this story. I think it's really her story. And obviously in the first episode where the Doctor isn't in it so much, she basically performs the role that the Doctor would in that scenario in normal circumstances. And again, she's back to being an investigative journalist, which you don't really get to see her being very often. So I think she works really well in this. And obviously in the middle part of the story, when she is building that relationship with the robot, I think that's particularly strong, because she's a very vulnerable but also a strong character as well. Yeah, so I think she makes the story, really. I think it's really helpful that the Brigadier sees the Doctor regenerating this time, because it would have been really awful to have to go through what we went through in Spearhead in Space again. Not that it was bad in Spearhead from Space, but it gives us the ability for the story to flow straight away, and the Brigadier to just accept that this is definitely the Doctor this time. And as my friend Matt says, this also gives it some continuity. It gives the story some continuity to have the Brigadier and Benton around. It's not just off somewhere else with a new Doctor. This is a continuation. There's a lovely little scene, a couple of lovely little scenes actually between the Doctor and the Brigadier that I really like. One is when the Doctor has a crushed flower and blows it in the Brigadier's face, and just the look of disgust on the Brigadier's face. And it's kind of a nice little moment because it sums up their relationship, and obviously the Brigadier knows that it's the Doctor, but it's just like, this is symbolic of how I get treated. That's the way he looks. It's really well acted, I think. And the other one is where the Brigadier is just simply assuming that the British part of UNIT would be the one that has to look after these important weapons, because no one else could be trusted. The Doctor calls him out very, very nicely on his patriotism, which is really good. It makes him look stupid very, very easily. I thought it was a really nice moment. So then we're going to end up seeing a lot of Harry Sullivan in this season. This is his first story. Ian Marter does a really good job of being this kind of bumbling, kind of patriotic, old-style guy, really. Obviously at the beginning he doesn't really have a great deal to do other than those wacky scenes with the Doctor, which is a bit of a shame, but then later he gets a little bit more to do. Of course, initially it wasn't known who the actor to play the Doctor would be. They didn't know if it was going to be a young guy, an older guy, someone who could be physical and so on. So that's why Harry was cast in the first place. So it was likely that if they got an older guy, then Harry would have been the physical element of the story of Doctor Who. Just in the same way that Ian Chesterton was the physical side of the first Doctor's incarnation, and obviously Jamie was there during the second Doctor's time, and so on and so forth. So it would have been interesting to see if they'd gone down that route. But as it happened, they went down the route of getting an actor who could be physical, and therefore Harry very quickly actually looks a little bit redundant in places, and it's not a surprise that Harry doesn't last as long as longer than a season. Although of course, being the physical element of the story doesn't stop you from getting knocked out by fascists when you end up at their hideout. And that means that he is left out of the story for quite a long time. You get the sense that there's a few too many characters, and I suppose it's quite difficult to bring in a new physical character in the context of UNIT. He's pretty much there as a kind of replacement to Mike Yates in a way. I think the skipping scene is particularly good, and obviously Ian Marter plays that really well, and Harry the character is just going along with this mad person that he sees in front of him, and I think it's the kind of scene that gives the story a pretty poor reputation, because it's not the kind of thing that we see the Fourth Doctor doing in later episodes. But I actually think it's really, really good, and It's also rather, it's pretty childish. I mean, this is a story that is clearly aimed at a younger audience than perhaps later Tom Baker stories. And I also think that as fans, it's, especially adult fans, we kind of gravitate towards the more serious stories, and we forget that actually it's a program that encompasses a family audience. And I think we should have a bit more, a little bit more respect for some of the childish elements of Doctor Who. We haven't, we like a program that is made for a wider audience than just adults, and it's crazy to just kind of dismiss stories on the basis of not being grown up enough or having childish elements. But yeah, it's a shame that it gets a bad reputation because of some of the silliness and some of the childlike parts of the story. We also see the start of a relationship between Sarah and Harry, and obviously Sarah finds him rather old-fashioned, and that's a theme that's going to carry on once the two of them start travelling in the TARDIS regularly. Starting with Professor Kettlewell, who I think is fantastic, and a little bit complex in terms of motivation, or maybe that's just badly written. But I like the look. I like the Mad Professor look, and again, it's part of the story which is ridiculous and clearly aimed at the youngest portion of the audience. And again, it's something that someone could look at and just dismiss as being silly or whatever. But you know, in terms of Mad Professor, you can't get a better look than that. It's utterly brilliant. I think Edward Burnham plays the part really well. Plays it with some real kind of vulnerability, and you know, you get the sense that this is someone who initially is very, very concerned about the way that their scientific discoveries can be taken. Miss Winters is cold and serious and utterly dangerous. Often you get just male villains in Doctor Who. You don't often get female villains who are the heads of organisations in the same way that you don't tend to get them in James Bond films either. And Patricia Maynard plays this really well. It's a really interesting part, and it's also clear that Terrance Dicks is trying to bring some form of storytelling that involves feminism in some way. I don't think he gets it right at all, and you know, he's clearly trying to make a point about feminism and how you can end up with women in top positions, in key positions. It doesn't mean that they're going to be nice people. It's the general point I think he's trying to make. Well, I think that's, you know, it's fairly obvious, yeah. But it kind of falls flat, and it doesn't really go anywhere other than trying to make cheap shots, really. But it is interesting that you get some recurring themes in this era of Doctor Who, in the Barry Letts and Terrance Dicks era of Doctor Who, where Terrance Dicks is often allowing his conservatism to come out a little bit, but meanwhile Barry Letts has got a much more kind of liberal approach to life, I think, and the two kind of collide and produce some really interesting characters. And then when you've got in other stories where you've got Malcolm Hulke maybe writing, and you know, his Marxism coming out as well, all of these kind of influences blend to create this bizarre world which is Doctor Who in the early 1970s, mid 1970s. It's brilliant. The character of Jellicoe is a little bit frustrating, because you feel as though there could be much more to do with him, and of course one of the problems is that he's effectively the secretary to Miss Winters, and so perhaps we wouldn't expect anything more to come of his character in a story where the think tank organisation was headed up by a man, it would be a female secretary, and that character would be absolutely nothing, peripheral to the plot, which is what Jellicoe is. The really interesting thing about Jellicoe is that the original casting choice was Colin Baker, which would have been really interesting to see him in that role before, many years before he had the chance to play the part of the Doctor. So let's take a look at the villains, starting with the robot. I think Michael Kilgareth puts in a brilliant performance in what is a ridiculous and cumbersome costume, which looks great when it's not moving. But he also plays the part and acts it brilliantly. He was speaking the lines from inside the costume, and he gives the robot a real vulnerability. You believe in the character of the robot, which I think comes across very, very well. And that's a very difficult thing to do, particularly when the robot, like I say, doesn't move very well. And he plays it really well, I think, in the voice. The voice carries over an awful lot. It's quite a tender portrayal, which is not the kind of thing you would think you're going to say about a robot that gets to be the size of King Kong. And I was reading that he actually fainted during the filming of one of the scenes, fainted inside the robot, and I think there's a scene where you can see it beginning to fall, which is when it happened. Obviously, in terms of character motivation, you've got this Prime Directive stuff, which Terrance Dicks is taking from Asimov. And also I thought there was some elements of Forbidden Planet, the film Forbidden Planet, coming through as well, which I quite liked. Think Tank is a rather odd organisation. I think the story is underpinned by worries and concerns about fuel crises and dwindling resources and that kind of thing. And this think tank has been created in that environment. We tend to think of environmental groups as being on the left, but here we have a fascist environmental group that wants the world to be run on the basis of scientific fact. And this is an idea actually that goes back a long way in humanity. The idea of philosopher kings, the idea of instead of relying on politicians, we should rely on people who know what they're talking about. And of course it's fundamentally anti-democratic, which is where the fascism comes in. And I think it also taps into those fears that maybe a conservative writer like Terrance Dicks might have of environmentalism, of conservatism has part of its heart in the management of the ecology, the ecological systems and the countryside and so on. And so I think he's bringing that out a little bit, and having that fear of what if you mix that with science, what if you mix that then with power. Maybe I'm looking at it too deeply, I don't know, but I think it's quite interesting that at that time environmental activists could be seen as something that is dangerous to democracy and dangerous in a kind of bullying way, that you will be safe, you will be protected, but we're going to do it by controlling the planet and controlling humanity. There were some similar themes in the story Invasion of the Dinosaurs just a year prior to this story as well. So it's a theme that kind of comes out, even though that was written by Malcolm Hulke, and so that was written by a Marxist. But you have similar themes coming around, that people who campaign for the environment could actually be dangerous. And the idea that science is a threat is an old sci-fi theme as well. You think back to things like Frankenstein and to Jekyll and Hyde and The Invisible Man as kind of templates for that kind of fear story. My friend Matt says that Think Tank couldn't be more obviously villainous unless they stuck a curly moustache on and went whoa, Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, they are so obviously villains. But then again, in the context of Pertwee era Doctor Who, it's no surprise that we might find villains working together on some scientific, in some scientific group that you can infiltrate if you're an investigative journalist and find something out. If they had their own factory, even better. Let's take a look at some of the special effects then. This was directed by Chris Barry, and he really didn't want to use the footage of the tank, the toy tank, once he'd made it, but Barry Letts insisted on keeping it in. That says quite a lot, I think, about the direction of this story, and I think it's a shame. Maybe, well, it did look as though Barry Letts regretted that in later years. It's a shame it crept in. So Chris Barry chose the same type of effect as when he worked on the Demons to produce the growing of Azal for the growing of the robot. And you have to wonder whether that was the right decision, considering that I think that the Azal getting bigger doesn't actually look that good either. And it certainly didn't work with the robot. And some of the problems that came out on location and were impossible to eradicate. So you can see that they might have thought, well, this is the way we're going to do it. But considering it hadn't worked the first time particularly well, why would they think it would work well this time? I really don't know. So I think that was a bad decision. I know it's silly and I know it doesn't look brilliant, but the crushing of the soldier with the robot's foot is something that I quite like. It doesn't really work as well as it should in this story, but I do like the fact that they gave it a go, and it reminds me of all those Godzilla effects that you see in those old movies. So I quite like that. There is a part in the story where Sarah is picked up by the robot, and then we see her dangling from the robot's pincer as a doll, and the doll looks absolutely shockingly appalling and so obvious. It's as bad as the tank, if not worse, and not entirely necessary either. So again, it's something that they could have easily cut out, but then this programme was underrunning as well, so they probably didn't want to make too many cuts. I was quite impressed with the effects for what the robot sees. I mean, it's not particularly helpful for what we see, I have to say. You can't really tell sometimes what the robot's looking at, but presumably the robot knows what it's doing. And I think it was particularly effective because they didn't want to reveal the robot at the beginning of the first episode. They wanted to wait for that reveal at the end of the first episode. So having some kind of sense of we're inside this thing and we're seeing what it sees is effective, and it's effective for the running of the story as well, because this robot appears incredibly innocent, and yet because we've seen from inside it, we know what it's capable of. We know what it is doing, even if it thinks it's doing the right thing. And I think that's effective. I think that works really well, and it helps to build the tension. It helps to build the tension in terms of what is this robot going to do, and then of course the payoff for that is that suddenly the robot is huge. We've already seen what it's capable of because of its programming, and now it's massive and it's got weapons. Brilliant. I also think that in those scenes, that's where Dudley Simpson's score comes into its own. The kind of creepy music that accompanies what the robot is doing when we're seeing through the robot's eyes, as it were. I think that works really well. Other than that, it's standard Dudley Simpson really, but yeah, those moments I think are really good. In terms of costume design, Jim Aitchison designed not just Tom Baker's costume. Obviously he didn't actually make the scarf as long as it turned out to be. There's a whole load of stories around that people can check up on. But he was responsible for the outfit as a whole and for designing the robot. And the design of the robot I just think is absolutely brilliant. I think it looks fantastic. Like I've said, it doesn't move well, but it looks so striking and so unlike any other robot design that I can think of. I mean, in terms of size, when it's normal size, it's similar to something like the robot on Forbidden Planet, but it's just so different. It just looks really, really good. Really like it. There are some scenes where Chris Barrie does some low shots of the robot when it's at normal size, and also some shots above it. And the ones that from low down are really, really effective. They give this robot is big before it grows massive, and so it's really effective when the camera is down low. It doesn't really happen enough. I think that Chris Barrie was responsible for the skipping scene, which I've already said that I really enjoy. He's also worked with Tom Baker on getting the scarf into the story as much as possible, which I think again is a really nice little trait. Also responsible for some costume changes for Sarah as well, so you get to see a little bit more realistic if characters actually disappear for a while and come back with different clothes, isn't it? It's a bit more like real life, which is helpful. And I think there's some really lovely directed bits in this. I think particularly the bit where Sarah is in her car and wants the security guard to let her into the think tank premises, and he goes off to ring his superiors, and then she decides to bunk off in her car and cross over a wall. Some of the directing in that is beautiful, seeing the characters through the slots in the stonework on the wall, for example. I think that worked really, really well. Really nice to see that kind of touch, much more kind of cinematic and a bit more interesting than just the normal kind of fare that we would be used to. So I think he added some nice touches. But Chris Barrie also tried to tone down the King Kong elements of the stories and the parallels to King Kong in this, which I think is a shame, because this is something really that can be played up to all its strength. And why not? Why not actually make it really, really close to what it's trying to copy? No one's going to be fooled that you're not copying this thing. We all know what you're copying. Why not just go for it? Give it some real welly. Terrance Dicks convinced Robert Holmes that as outgoing script editor he had the right to write the first story of the new era, and people went for this, which is how this story got made, or written rather. Robert Holmes meanwhile was obviously script editing this, but also working on all of the other stories, so you don't in this get yet the gothic direction that Philip Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes are going to take Doctor Who in. That is going to start pretty soon though, when we look at Ark in Space next time. So, my verdict. What am I going to give this out of 10? On the one hand, it is incredibly poor in many respects. The special effects don't make the story work as well as they should. It is quite an ambitious idea, this King Kong parallel. It's an unsettling story in the fact that it's a new Doctor story, but lots of new Doctor stories are not particularly brilliant. So I don't think it should be marked down on that. I don't think it should be marked down on the fact that it is made for kids. It is definitely aimed at the younger end of the audience. But it is middle of the road Doctor Who. If it was in the Pertwee era properly, with Pertwee starring, I think it would still be middle of the road. But I don't think it's as poor as people make out. I think it's just I just think it doesn't gel well. It doesn't work. Some of the elements don't come together in the way you hope they would do, and the Doctor hasn't come fully formed. The Doctor isn't the Doctor yet, really. The fact that there's morality issues around what the Doctor's doing here, and that the answer to resolving this problem is to simply kill the baddie, which is a baddie that is clearly sentient and clearly has feelings, is a little bit problematic, and one that we tend to overlook in Doctor Who. I don't think you can overlook it. I've been kind of thinking, is this a 4 or a 5 out of 10? And then I think to myself, well look, hang on, they were also attempting some new stuff here. The outside broadcast with these cameras, this is going to be something that's going to be perfected over the years. It hasn't been here, but it shows promise, and I think one of the wonderful things about Doctor Who is that it's experimental, and you know, experimental in mid-1970s Doctor Who meant that you could see special effects one week on Doctor Who, the next week on Top of the Pops, the next week in a drama again, and so, you know, you've got to give it some credit for these kind of decisions that were being taken. This is exploring the dimensions of television and trying to go beyond them, and surprisingly enough, sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it creaks and it's not smooth. So on that basis, I am going to give Robot 6 out of 10, which I think is rather generous, and other people, well, why don't you tell me what you think of it? Why don't you add some comments and tell me what you think of the story, give it your rating out of 10, and next time I'm going to be looking at the Ark in Space, Tom's second story, as we move through this season. And if you want to add comments about what you think of that, I'll try and work them into the review next time. But for now, thank you.